Somewhere around 400,000 years ago, a group of early humans walked into a valley in what is now southern France. They were not looking for food. They were not following game. They were looking for a place to build something. They picked a spot near a stream, cleared the ground, gathered branches, and built an oval structure with a hearth in the center. Then they lived there, and when they left, they or their descendants, it does not sound like much. A hut, a hearth, a floor, but that hut marks a line in human history. Before it, humans moved through the world, following food and seasons, sleeping wherever the night found them. After it, humans began to stay. The shelter, and then the house, and then the village, and then the city. All of it starts with the decision to build a permanent place. The engineering behind the first shelters is one of the most underrated stories in human history. It required understanding materials, weight, wind, water, and heat. It required planning weeks ahead. It required cooperation, and it produced the structures that eventually became your house. Before we walk through the sites, it is worth asking why anyone would settle down at all. For 2 million years, humans were nomads, and nomadism has advantages. You follow the food. You move when the water runs out. You never exhaust one spot, but nomadism has a cost. You can only carry so much, and you cannot store food, tools, or knowledge beyond what you can carry. Settling down meant giving up mobility, and the only reason to do it was that a place could provide enough food all year to make staying worth it. The first settlements grew where resources were rich, along rivers, on lakeshores, and near stands of wild grain. The house is what abundance builds. Nobody builds a permanent home in a place where they will starve by winter. Let me walk you through how it happened. The earliest shelters were probably not shelters at all in the way we think. For most of human prehistory, people slept in the open, under trees or in caves. Caves were the first permanent homes, free rooms provided by geology, dry, defensible, and already there. But caves have limits. They are not everywhere. They are cold, and they are shared with bears, hyenas, and other tenants who do not pay rent. At some point, humans started building their own rooms, and the oldest candidate for that moment is a site called Terra Amata. Terra Amata sits on the coast of southern France, in what is now the city of Nice. In the 1960s and 1970s, the archaeologist Henry de Lumley excavated the site and found something unexpected. Oval arrangements of stones, post holes, and central hearths, which he interpreted as the remains of huts built about 400,000 years ago by Homo erectus. The huts appear to have been built from branches, with stones holding down the base and a hearth at the center for fire. The interpretation of Terra Amata has been debated since it was published. Some researchers question whether the post holes were really posts and whether the structures were really huts. But even the skeptics agree that the site shows something important. 400,000 years ago, humans were organizing living space around fire in a deliberate layout, in the open. That is the seed of architecture. The house begins as a fire and a circle of stones. Now let me show you the next big step, which appears much later in a place that could not be more different. Homo II is a site on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel, and it was occupied about 23,000 years ago, at the very end of the last ice age. The site was preserved in extraordinary condition because it was flooded and sealed by the rising lake. The archaeologist Danny Nadel, who excavated Homo II, found the remains of brushwood huts, oval in shape, with floors of packed earth and a stone-lined hearth in the center of the largest one. Homo II is a treasure house of early human life. The huts contained grinding stones, and on those stones, scientists found starch grains from wild cereals. The people of Homo II were grinding wild wheat and barley into flour. 23,000 years ago, thousands of years before agriculture was invented. They were also fishing, hunting, and gathering. The camp had everything a group needed: shelter, food, water, and fire. It was not a permanent city, it was a seasonal base, a home that people returned to year after year, and it is one of the oldest known examples of a constructed living space. Building a house also meant building a routine. The hearth was the first piece of furniture, and the fire in it structured the whole day. Cooking, warmth, light, protection, and gathering all happened around it. The layout of a prehistoric home, hearth in the center, sleeping area at the back, storage by the wall, is a template that survives in houses around the world today. When you walk into a living room, you are walking into a space that was designed, in its bones, 10,000 years ago, around a fire and the people who sat around it. Every shelter that humans built had to solve the same physics problem, even if nobody used the word physics. A wall has to stand up against the wind. A roof has to shed rain and snow without collapsing. A hearth has to sit where the smoke can escape and the heat can be kept. The earliest builders learned these rules by watching what failed. A hut that faced the wrong direction let the wind in. A roof that was too flat collected water and sagged. A foundation on wet ground rotted and sank. Each failure was a lesson. By the time of the Natufians, builders were choosing sites for drainage, orientation, and shelter from wind, making decisions that a modern architect would recognize. Climate was pushing in the same direction. The end of the last ice age, roughly 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, warmed the planet and reshaped the landscape. Wild cereals spread across the Near East, forming dense stands that could feed a family for months. Lakes and rivers filled, concentrating fish and waterfowl. The warmer, wetter world created exactly the conditions where staying in one place became possible. The first villages did not appear because people suddenly became smarter. They appeared because the world suddenly became richer. The house is a response to opportunity, and the opportunity was the climate. Now we come to the strangest and most spectacular chapter in the story of building. The mammoth bone houses about 15,000 years ago in the grasslands of what is now Ukraine. Groups of hunters built houses out of the bones of mammoths. At a site called Mežerich, archaeologists have found the remains of several circular dwellings, each built from hundreds of mammoth bones and tusks. The bones were arranged in a circle with heavy skulls and jaws at the base, long bones as the framework, and tusks forming the entrance. The structures were several meters across, big enough for a family, and each had a hearth inside. Think about the engineering. A mammoth bone weighs tens of kilograms. A single house used the bones of dozens of mammoths. The builders had to source the bones from hunts or from the frozen carcasses of animals that died naturally, carry them to the site, and arrange them in a load-bearing pattern. The skulls formed the foundation. The long bones were the columns, the tusks were the doorframe. On top, the builders stretched hides and piled turf, creating a dome that kept out the wind and held in the heat. The mammoth bone houses are not crude piles of bones. They are designed structures. The bones are sorted by type, arranged in patterns, and fitted together. Some of the houses show signs of being rebuilt, expanded, and repaired. These were homes, not camps. The people who built them came back to them, maintained them, and lived in them through the brutal winters of the Ice Age steppe. A house made from the bones of a giant extinct elephant is one of the most impressive pieces of prehistoric engineering ever found. The same era produced permanent homes in a completely different environment. Along the coasts of Japan, the Jomon culture built villages of pit houses, sunken round shelters with thatched roofs, starting around 15,000 years ago. The Jomon lived on shellfish, fish, nuts, and game, and their settlements were so rich that they produced some of the earliest pottery in the world, clay pots made for cooking and storing food. The pit house is a clever piece of engineering. By digging the floor below ground level, you gain insulation for free. The earth itself becomes your wall. The Jomon did not need agriculture to settle down. They had the ocean, which never runs out of food if you know how to harvest it. The next chapter brings us to the edge of the modern world, about 12,000 years ago in the eastern Mediterranean. A culture called the Natufians did something that had never been done on such a scale. They stopped moving. The Natufians were hunter-gatherers, but they were hunter-gatherers who had figured out how to make a place produce enough food to stay. They harvested wild cereals, gathered nuts, hunted gazelle, and fished, and they built permanent villages. At the site of Ain Malahah in Israel, archaeologists have found the remains of round houses built of stone, with plastered floors and central hearths. The houses were partially dug into the ground, which insulated them, and they were grouped together in a village layout. The people of Ain Malahah were living in houses in a village hundreds of years before the first farm. This is the architectural transition that changed everything. A mobile group carries its shelter on its back. A settled group builds its shelter into the ground. The settled group can accumulate things, tools, grain, knowledge, because it has a place to keep them. The settled group can grow because it can support more people in one place. The village is the ancestor of the city, and the first villages were built by people who had not yet planted a single crop. The materials of these early villages were chosen for a reason. Mud brick, the material of Ain Malahah, and later Tamdai Tal Swine K, is made by mixing mud with water and a binding material, often straw, and letting it dry in the sun. It is free, it is everywhere, and it insulates well. The straw stops the bricks from cracking as they dry, the same principle that makes fiber-reinforced concrete work today. Mud brick is not a primitive material. It is a sophisticated one, and it is still used to build homes in many parts of the world. When the people of Sumbaitak plastered their walls, they were using lime plaster that had to be made by heating limestone, a process that requires both knowledge and fuel. The first houses were not slapped together. They were manufactured from processed materials. And then, about 11,500 years ago, something truly strange happened. The people who built the first monumental structures on Earth had no agriculture, no pottery, no metal, and no permanent houses to speak of. They were hunter-gatherers, and they moved enormous stones. Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, is a hilltop covered with circles of massive T-shaped stone pillars, each weighing up to 20 tons. The pillars are carved with images of animals, foxes, snakes, birds, and abstract symbols. They were erected about 11,500 years ago, which makes them older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than agriculture itself. And they were built by people who did not have farming, writing, or even villages. How do you move a 20-ton pillar without wheels, without metal, without domesticated animals? The builders of Göbekli Tepe did it with ramps, rollers, ropes, and enormous amounts of human labor. They quarried the stone, shaped it, moved it up the hill, and stood it upright in a circle. This is engineering on a scale that was previously thought impossible for hunter-gatherers. The site rewrote the story of human architecture. Monumental building did not come after civilization. It helped create it. Göbekli Tepe also reveals the social side of building. Moving a 20-ton pillar is not a one-family job. It requires a crew, organizers, food to feed the workers, and a reason to do it. The construction of Göbekli Tepe implies that hunter-gatherers could organize large groups, plan long projects, and coordinate effort on a scale previously thought impossible. The building project itself may have been what created the social bonds that later made farming and cities possible. The structure is not just architecture, it is evidence of the human ability to cooperate, written in stone. The final stop on this tour is the first true city. Atalwainkek in central Turkey was occupied from about 9,000 years ago, and at its peak, it was home to thousands of people. The settlement is a honeycomb of mud brick houses, built wall to wall, with no streets. People entered their homes through holes in the roof, climbing down ladders. The houses were plastered, painted with murals of animals and hunting scenes, and the dead were buried beneath the floors. A Tarfyake is the end point of the journey that started at Terra Amata. The hut became a house. The house became a village. The village became a city. By the time of Suvantavantai Tarfyake, humans had completely changed how they lived. They no longer followed food. They grew it. They no longer slept where the night found them. They slept in rooms they had built, on platforms they had made, under roofs they had constructed. The architecture had become the world. Density brought new engineering problems. When thousands of people live wall to wall in mud brick houses, fire becomes a catastrophe waiting to happen. The people of Sumdai Talfyake managed this with careful housekeeping. Hearths built into the walls, plastered floors that could be cleaned and renewed, and houses that were regularly rebuilt on top of old ones. The mound of Fundai Talyak grew taller over centuries as old houses were flattened and new ones built on the rubble. That is not chaos. It is urban renewal, Neolithic style. The builders were managing the problems of density long before the word city existed. The house also became a place of meaning, not just protection. In Thuftwaitake, the walls were painted with scenes of hunting and animals. The dead were buried beneath the floors so that families lived on top of their ancestors. The house was the center of identity, the place where you were born, where your parents were buried, where your family story was stored in the plaster and the paint. This is the moment when architecture becomes more than engineering. It becomes memory. A home is not just a shelter, it is a container of a life. And that idea, which every modern person understands instantly, was invented in the first permanent houses. Settling down also changed human society in a way that is still with us. A nomad owns what they can carry. A settled person owns a place. The first permanent homes created the first property, and property created new rules about who could enter, who could build. The storage pit full of grain, the house with plastered walls, the land around it, these became things that could belong to a family and be passed down. The house is where the idea of private property was born, along with the inequalities and the security that came with it. Every mortgage and every landlord traces back to a decision made by the first people who stopped moving. Look at the engineering thread running through all of these sites. Every one of them solved the same problems. Shelter from weather, defense from predators and enemies. A place for fire, a place to sleep, a place to keep things. The materials changed, branches, brush, bones, stone, mud brick. But the problems did not, and the solutions got better because each generation built on the work of the last. The people of Sindai Talfyake never saw Terra Amata, but they were standing on 400,000 years of accumulated building knowledge. The structural logic behind all of these buildings is worth naming. Every one of them is a system of compression and load. The walls carry the weight of the roof. The roof spreads the load across the walls. The foundation spreads the load into the ground. A mammoth bone is a column. A mud brick is a block. A thatched roof is a beam system. The builders never used the words, but they understood the physics because they could see what happened when a wall was too thin, a roof too heavy, or a foundation too soft. The first architects were failures first. Their buildings taught them collapse by collapse. There is a quiet lesson in this story about what a house is for. The ancient building tradition is not dead. It is still alive in the houses of the modern world. The earth houses of the American Southwest descend from ancient building methods. The thatched roofs of Europe and Asia carry the same logic as the brushwood huts of Ohalo II. The modern movement toward natural building, rammed earth, straw bale, and passive solar design, is, in many ways, a return to principles that the first builders discovered by trial and error. The old knowledge never went away. It just got buried under steel and concrete, waiting to be remembered. There is also a question that archaeologists still argue about. When does a camp become a home? A camp is a place you sleep. A home is a place you return to, maintain, and defend. The line between them is not sharp. The brushwood huts of Homo II were probably revisited for generations. The houses of Ain Malahar were built to last. The bone houses of Mesurich were repaired and expanded. Each step, from sleeping place to seasonal base to permanent home, took thousands of years. But the direction was always the same. Humans were becoming creatures that stay. A house is not just a roof, it is a storage unit for knowledge. The permanent shelter let humans keep their tools, their grain, their supplies, and their skills in one place. It let them accumulate, and accumulation is what made everything else possible. The surplus, the trade, the cities, the libraries. The house is the container that made civilization possible, because you cannot build a civilization if you have to carry everything you own on your back. The next time you walk into your home, take a moment to think about what you are standing in. That house is the descendant of a line of structures stretching back 400,000 years. The fire circle at Terra Amata, the brushwood hut at Homo II, the bone dome at Mesurich, the stone roundhouse at Ain Malahar, the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the mud brick walls of Tuinde Atalfi. They are all inside your walls. You are not standing in a building. You are standing in the accumulated decisions of every builder who ever lived. 400,000 years of home.